So again, welcome everyone. I'm Jeannie Kitchens, Associate Director with SIUC Center for Workforce Development, of course, Credential Engine Partner. And we do have some topics that we want to cover today on the agenda. And if there's any other topics that any of you would like us to talk about or any other additional questions, please do go ahead and put them into the chat or go ahead and ask. We're still getting a little reverb. Will be Scott Cheney, Executive Director with Credential Engine. He's going to give everyone a little brief overview. Unfortunately, Stuart Sutton is a little bit under the weather, and so we're not going to ask him to speak today, but he may want to put some things in the chat for us to cover. And then we're going to talk about the big picture. You know, the Credential Engine launched on December 7th, and so we thought, and we've over time, you know, clearly we've talked about a lot of the pieces and parts, but what we wanted to do today was kind of pull them together in the context of that launch so you could know what the plan is, you know, what we have going on and what's available now in 2018. And Nate Argo is going to join me with that. And then Nate and Mike Parsons will talk a little bit about the Registry Assistant API that's available as well. And I would ask, in particular, the Credential Engine partners, Robbie Robson, who's on, who is our competency infrastructure expert, and of course, as I said, Stuart, who's our metadata expert. Phil will be covering the World W3C community group. To, you know, chime in at any time. So, Scott, can I turn the next couple of slides over to you?
You may. Good morning, everybody. Just want to do a couple of overview slides for everybody so you get a sense of where we're at. As you can see from this quick stats update, we have been growing fairly steadily, and we're growing in a way that we're trying to maintain the quality assurance on the registry. So you'll see a couple of different breakdowns here. The first is the credential registry, those credentials and organizations that are actually searchable and comparable right now on Credential Finder. There are 978 credentials that are there from 124 different organizations. We do have a larger number of credentials that are in still our sandbox. They have been submitted to us, and they're in some stage of review and approval, both by the provider and by us, to make sure that what is going public is fully signed off on. So we have a number of organizations that have quite a large number of credentials that are preparing to go public. Ivy Tech Community College in Indiana has over 300 credentials that are waiting to be fully and finally approved and put out. We have Capella University, the same situation. Medical education training campus with the military is in the same position. So as those get reviewed and published, we will be much closer to 1,500 or 2,000 credentials that are on the public side of the Credential Finder. And we're continuing conversations with a number of states and institutions about bringing either some or all of their credentials into the registry over the coming weeks. Some of the work that we're looking forward to doing this year, this is a summary of the high-level points that we're going to be focusing on, but we are intending to get from 2,000 credentials here on January 26th. Our goal is to reach 50,000 credentials by the end of this year. We have a report that's coming out in a few weeks that will, for the first time, provide an overview of all of the credentials that are in the country. I think we have a slide on that next. So getting to 50,000 is going to be quite a jump from where we are, but it's still going to be just a drop in the bucket of the number of credentials that we're looking to get. We are rolling out an RFP next week in order to select 2 new state partnerships. Most of you know that we have a very strong partnership with Indiana, and we have a growing partnership with New Jersey. We're going to be adding at least 2 more with some funding that we received, and the goal is to get up to 10 states by the end of the year that are in a formal partnership with us. We're continuing to expand our work within the military with some business employers through the Business Roundtable, growing the number of institutions that we're working with as well. We also are hopeful that we're going to be in a position by the end of the year to begin to publish some of our first international credentials through the registry once we feel like we have the processes in place to ramp up the U.S. The credential transparency description language continues to grow and to expand and evolve. We're going to be working to add some additional terms and descriptions around quality assurance, labor market value, employer signaling, and education and career pathways. Those are all things that the TAC will obviously be very centrally focused on, but we'll be working on all of those with our other advisory groups as well in order to build those out and get those shaped the right way. And then we're going to talk a little bit more throughout this presentation on work that's going to be taking place to expand and enhance our publishing methods, especially some of our harvesting ability to take credential data straight from a institution or organization that is publishing it in ways and outputting it in ways that we can harvest from. Quality is going to be another major focus of our work now that we're successfully launched, and Jeannie's team has done all of the enormously hard work of getting the registry public, of building the account establishment and verification and authentication processes. We're going to be turning to some of the internal auditing, reporting requirements that we need to address in order to make sure that we continue to focus on the quality in the registry. We do have a minimum data policy, and that is going to remain. We're going to add to that this year by building some models for best practice credential listings. What we don't want to do is to have organizations just publish their minimum data and think that is really all they have to do. That's the least they have to do, but we'd like them to be aiming for a richer description of their credentials in order to provide better data to the users. So we're going to be putting out those best practice models so they have something to shoot for and to aim at. And then we're going to be doing some work to develop some user guides for the end user, whether it be a student, a parent, an employer, to understand how to interpret the data that is in the registry. We're continuing to expand our work with vendors and app developers. We've done now 2 showcases where we had 6 partners who demonstrated how they were going to be using the data to operate in the higher ed space. Just a couple weeks ago, we did a showcase with 2 organizations that work in employment and the employer space. And then next month, we're going to have 4 or 5 different organizations that do work more in the K-12 space who are going to be doing presentations about how they're going to be building applications to use the data. We'll continue to do those showcases, but we also are going to go out and be more purposeful about seeding the marketplace. We have some funding from JPMorgan Chase to support an app development contest. Our loose word for it, we're really going to be doing some regional events, some hackathons, some showcases to get more ideas into the marketplace about how this data can be used. And then the other 2 areas that I highlighted for the board and I'm highlighting for you, in addition to working with states partners to get credentials in, we're going to be doing some more work with states around policy to support the transformation of data so that it is more transparent at the state level for what we're trying to provide here through Credential Engine. And then, of course, always focus on the business development aspect to make sure that we as an entity stay around for a while. And as I mentioned, we have been working on the first ever inventory of credentials, how many are actually out there. This is just from the United States. The report will be coming out shortly, but to date we have successfully identified and have a 99.9% confidence that there are at least this 308,895. We get very precise here at Credential Engine. That data reflects primarily licenses, certifications, degrees, and registered apprenticeships. We're working to add to that list a count of high school diplomas, unregistered apprenticeships to the degree that we can actually identify them with confidence, licenses and certifications that are not tracked by the Department of Labor databases. So we found some that show up in some counts but not at DOL, so we're looking into those. Badges, and then military credentials. We're working to get a good solid count about how many are provided in the military, and we'll get that report out as soon as we can and try and get some press and some publicity around that. And then I think I turn it back over to Jeannie at this point.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Scott. And if anyone has any questions or comments, go ahead and feel free to speak or put them in the chat. I'll just pause for a moment, and I'm planning to just talk a little bit about the showcase cases that Scott had mentioned. Okay. No questions or comments?
I'll be here in case.
So, Scott. Okay, great. Scott had mentioned the what we call application showcases, and what they basically are opportunities for software companies, systems, application developers, existing products, for example, to demonstrate concepts for integrating the Credential Engine metadata from the credential registry. Well, it's either way. You could be putting data in or you could be getting it out and using it. And I just want to point out that the Credential Engine's mission supports this as a part of the mission of promoting transparency. A part of that is driving an open applications marketplace. So that application marketplace that intersects with credential information is rather wide and broad and big. So we are looking across all of it, and there are just some examples here. So these are the kinds of systems, applications, software, products, and so forth that we've been out identifying through various partnerships with our credential registry participants and so forth, and making connections to learn more about use cases that Credential Engine can support. So the application showcases are presentations at this time of concepts. And there was a series of concepts demonstrated on December 11th, and again on January 18th. The January 18th focused on employer applications, and we have another one coming up in February, and you can go ahead and register for that showcase if you're interested in watching it. If you're participating and you would like to, with this webinar, would like to be a part of a showcase, also let us know. We always have a more the merrier kind of attitude. We want to bring as many partners in as possible and begin looking at those concepts. What are the use cases that the Credential Engine needs to support across that marketplace? So when I see Carrie just put in a couple of URLs, so anyone who would like to watch those archived videos, go on over to YouTube later and watch them. And I think Carrie's probably going to drop in that registration, so you can go ahead and register for the next showcase. And unless there's any comments or questions about that, I would like to turn it over to Phil Barker to give everyone an update on the Educational and Occupational Credentials community group. Phil,
yep, well,
can you fill everyone in?
It's a mouthful, isn't it? Educational and Occupational Credentials in Schema.org community group, which I think I might just call the EO Cred group from now on, has been established for a few months now. It now has 24 members, including several names I see from the people who are on this call. But also including people from outside of the Credential Engine family and outside of the US. So I'm quite happy with the number of members that there are at the moment and with the level of participation. What we have done so far is we have created a set of about 30 outline use cases. These cover issues like direct search through search engines such as Google and Yahoo, refinements to those search, so once you've found something you might want some additional information about what it is that you've found. Secondary searches, these are the sort of follow-on searches that might come from having found a credential. For example, if you've found a credential, you might want to know who issues that credential or who gives the quality assurance for that credential, and a few non-search related use cases.
Hey Phil, you're pretty quiet. If you could turn up your volume.
1 second. Okay, that's the volume up to 11. Does that help?
Excellent.
So we have these use cases. We've gone through an exercise to give some idea of the relative importance or prioritization of those use cases. And also from each of the use cases we've derived 1 or 2 requirements. So for example, to be able to search for credentials by name, you need 2 things. First of all, you need to know that this thing that's being described somewhere on the web is actually an educational and occupational credential. And you also know which bit of the text in the description is the name. We are currently working through these requirements that have arisen from the use cases to work out how to fulfill them using schema.org, wherever possible using terms that are already in the schema.org vocabulary, and where that's not possible, creating new terms which we will propose for addition. If you look on the wiki, you should be able to find this list of outline use cases. Against each use case you should be able to find the requirements, and for those requirements that we have already addressed, I think there's only 2 or 3, you should see a blue link from the requirement to the proposal to meet that requirement. I don't want to discuss here now all of the deep details of what we're going through. If you are interested in that, please join the mail list that is on the slide there, and then you'll get all the detail that you could ever want about these discussions. What I thought I might highlight, though, are some of the sort of high-level issues that are coming up through the discussions. There are 4 of these. First 3 are quite closely related, and the first one is just around modelling. Where in the schema hierarchy of types of things do educational and occupational credentials fit? Related to that, how much do we want to get involved in more generic credentials? Currently what we're suggesting is that an educational and occupational credential is a subtype of creative work. There's been a little bit of pushback against that, so I think it's something that we will discuss a little bit later in the process as well. And also that the recurrent suggestions that there should be in schema.org a more generic credential type, not necessarily an educational and occupational credential, and our EO creds would be a subtype of that. Another issue that's kind of related to modelling is the balance between pragmatism and semantic purity. So this has come up in a discussion around, do we need to have RDF classes declared for every type of thing that we're going to be referencing when we are describing credentials? I don't want to get too far into that discussion here, but I think it's related to another one of the high-level issues that's come up, which is what I kind of call the schema.org idiom. You know, possibly different programming languages, you tend to program in a different way. Some are more forgiving than others. Some are more pragmatic than others. Some are more pure than others. I think Schema.org is a very loose and pragmatic approach to describing semantic properties, and I think one of the things that's coming up through the discussions quite a lot is, I guess I could say, people getting used to that looseness and getting used to the idiom that's used in Schema.org. The general approach that's commonly used is perhaps less pure than many people are used to when creating RDF vocabularies. And the final sort of high-level issue that has been discussed is the relationship of the work of describing educational and occupational credentials in Schema.org to CTDL, which I try to put in terms of specialist versus non-specialist descriptions of credentials. If you want to share information about credentials with partners who understand credentials, then you're likely to want to use CTDL or something very similar to it. If you want to put descriptions of credentials onto the World Wide Web for general purpose use, then I think what we're creating in Schema.org is what you would want to use. And of course the aim is that the two are as compatible with each other as possible. So that's all I wanted to say. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Phil. Does anybody have any questions or comments for Phil? And I know Stuart probably would have something to add if he was up to talking today. But just as a reminder, so the CTDL was modeled on schema.org. And so if you go look at the technical website and you go back to the very early approach pages, we talk about this. So the Credential Engine feels it's really important that the work that, as the chair of this community group that Phil's working on, that his work is extremely important to the big picture, the bigger picture that we will cover next.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you, Phil.
Everyone hear me all right?
Right.
Sure.
Yeah, that's Nate. Hang on just a sec, Nate. So, earlier in the webinar, I talked about, and Scott talked about the launch that occurred on December 7th. And so what Nate's going to do is just go over what we refer to as the big picture to it'll tie in the work that Phil's working on now, that big picture of the web, and what is available now through Credential Engine. So with that launch, we were signaling to the world that the Credential Engine technologies are now available for publishing to the registry. Okay. So go ahead,
what we
Nate,
wanted to do here,
and take it
like
away.
Jenny said, is kind of go over the big picture of how Credential Engine sort of interacts and connects with and works with various organizations that are out there. So we've got a couple of diagrams in the next few slides, and the layout of these may look a little odd at first, but I think it'll make sense whenever we get to the end of it. So this first one here basically just shows that we have, in the real world out there right now, you've got organizations whose systems are driving their websites, their mobile apps, their desktop applications, all the stuff that people, the end users, interact with. In the case of websites, those are crawled by the major search engines, and you have all the data coming from those systems about credentials, about assessments, learning opportunities, or whatever they may call them in their systems. Those systems may or may not use open schemas. They may be able to communicate with each other through proprietary APIs. There's kind of a wide variety of things that are sort of out there in the world right now. And then Credential Engine, we're seeking to sort of harmonize all of that. So we've got kind of two major chunks to that operation. The first is the set of schemas that we offer. So that'll be CTDL and then the CTDL ASN. Those cover credentials, the stuff related to earning credentials, competencies, concepts and concept schemes, and all that good stuff there. And then we have, of course, the Credential Engine Registry, which is the repository of all the metadata about the actual credentials themselves, and again, all the other stuff that the schema covers. So there's sort of the two parts to our effort here. The schema helps drive the registry. And so within that schema here, we've got sort of three big areas of focus. One is the credentials and related entities. So that's going to be the CTDL, 71 classes and 200 plus properties. We have the competency framework stuff. That's going to be some additional classes and properties, and those are all based on the ASN description language. And then, of course, we have concept schemes. So both CTDL and CTDL ASN have a set of concept schemes with them. We've kind of put them together here in the last column. We've got across the two schemas, we've got 20 concept schemes and 130-odd concepts there. And so when we start to put the picture together, you can see that the Credential Engine is going to offer ways of allowing those systems to communicate with each other by offering that common schema. So as organizations out there operating today are able to map their data, their schemas, I suppose, to the CTDL, the CTDL ASN, and whatnot, that will aid in allowing those organizations to communicate directly with each other, both via computers and humans, I guess. So the idea here is that by enabling those links between the information and providing that structure via the sort of the common, I guess, language of the schemas, down there at the bottom we see we help unlock the full potential of linked data. And in order to actually sort of physically accomplish that, what we've been setting up most recently is what we call the authentication system, which is basically just the way in which organizations will connect to the tools and data that we offer in the Credential Engine. So you see here in this blue area, what the system registers is going to be not only the users but also the organizations. And by users in this case, I mean the developers and the organization staff, so the users of Credential Engine, not the end users here. So the idea is that in order to access the tools for publishing data, in order to access the tools for searching and finding data, you would go through the authentication system. So your organization basically will have an account, and through that you'll be provided the API keys and whatnot. I don't want to go into too much detail on that right now. And one other thing to note on this is the CTDL schema itself. You do not have to be authenticated to access the data for that. That is out there on the open web and will continue to be. It's just the data in the registry that we're sort of, I guess, securing behind the authentication system. And what this enables is well, there's kind of two buckets of target audiences, I guess, for Credential Engine. There's data publishers, and those are the organizations who are publishing information about credentials, competencies, concept schemes, quality assurance, basically any sort of data that we discuss and talk about, that the publishers would be putting that data into the registry. The benefit to them would be that they would then have their data in CTDL, so it's all in a common schema, which really helps enable the linked data aspect of it, which in turn allows them to communicate about that data with third-party systems, again, not just between their employees, but also between the actual systems themselves. So if you have multiple machines using the same schema, it's much easier to sort of transfer data and to mix and match data from a variety of systems. And the data consumers are more likely to be the ones who are doing a lot of that mixing and matching. So the benefit to them for the registry is, of course, to get the reliable and up-to-date information that we're getting straight from the publishers. So that this is not, we're not aggregating this data from third-party sources, and we're not trying to sort of sneak around and crawl these things. We're getting this directly from the publishers, the agreements we have with them. It also serves as a one-stop shop for data, so that if you're writing a website or an application or something else of that nature, and you're looking to pull in data about credentials from a variety of sources, you don't have to do the extra work of going to each one of those sources, registering your account with them, setting it up to pull from their various APIs, dealing with all the licensing constraints and whatnot. It just really saves you a lot of trouble because you can get all the information that you need from one place, all in the same schema. So it makes your job as an application developer on the consuming side immensely easier. And another benefit to having the registry is, of course, the sort of archival functionality of it, which enables data about credentials to be referenced well after the organizations that offer them have stopped offering them or potentially even disappeared. I certainly hope that doesn't happen. But, so if you have a college degree from, say, 10 years ago and that college doesn't offer it anymore, that degree will still be in the registry. It'll still have the CTID. It can still be referenced directly by any other third-party system. And of course, the last bullet there, again, is to enable these developers to create applications that are going to compare and contrast credentials because they're all using the same common schema. And this last slide here kind of ties back in with what Phil was going over a minute ago. So you'll notice the primary difference between this and the previous slides is going to be this section here, up in sort of the top left. So this is what we're looking to enable in the future, is to have major search engines sort of understand CTDL, or at least some subset of it, the part that eventually makes it into schema.org. So those search engines will be looking for that. Whenever they find it, they'll understand it. And any organization that is outputting CTDL on their websites, they will see the benefits of better SEO, better more hits to their website. Depending on how the search engines implement that data, there may be additional widgets on the actual search page. Those kinds of things that we've, I think, discussed in various meetings before. But the idea is that that sort of completes the round trip of the data and of benefits to the users of not only the registry but CTDL itself. I think we had a question from Robbie.
We did, and you know what, can I, because the next part we're going to get into the account system, can we address that there, Nate? Yeah, when we get here, so it's a good question, Robbie. But let me talk a little bit more about the publishing procedure, but before we do that, let me see if anybody else has any comments or questions on the slides that Nate covered. Pause just a moment. I think that the data will be publicly available via Credential Registry itself. Steve, a little bit more, but even though they will be secured.
Do you mean direct access to the actual, like the metadata records, or to the search API, Steve? Whatever you say, the data.
Was that this? I'm sorry, this is Stuart. My voice is a bit bad, but I think one could walk away from what you just said, that access to the credential registry is only through authentication, which would mean that there's a gateway between the public and the data.
So the public doesn't use the registry directly, so there could be public applications or systems that make that data available to the public to see it, if that's what you're referring to. So there is an example that so the credential finder, so the public isn't actually going to the registry. The registry is the metadata, and so that is why it's important to have that applications marketplace and systems and applications that will then use that data and make it available to the public.
In order to get to put off fears that this is locked behind a gate, you can't get to it. Nobody can get to it without it.
Yeah. Oh no, definitely. Yeah, definitely. That was just showing the system itself and getting data into the system. And a couple of points, though, that I'll clarify as well, are that Nate mentioned a couple of things where the data is coming directly from whoever owns or offers that information. Now, you will see in a moment here that we have two types of publishing, self-publishing or third-party publishing. But the system is not planned to be an aggregator, like a search engine like Google that doesn't actually provide the content. They depend on others to provide it, and then they just go get it, but they're getting it without your, necessarily with your permission. So the authentication system is aimed at having a couple of purposes apart from just having an account, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Support all of the different types of publishing options that are available. And just wanted to clarify, because we will want to go out and get data from the web. So we referred to that to the past as harvesting, so we've got that in here as harvesting. But it won't be just any information. It's going to have to be metadata that is, uses the CTDL and is encoded in a way that we can go get it. So, Carrie, I have questions about updates and versioning. Do you want to
yes, can you hear me
answer
okay?
those questions, Carrie?
Awesome. My question has to do with updates that are made to published credentials and versioning. So say it's the difference between minor edits and maybe major edits. So it's say the same credential, but the criteria has changed. And in the past we've talked about versioning, and I'm wondering if if Nate maybe could explain how that's being handled in the system so that the changes can be viewed through the data that's queried. Or possibly through URLs for each version or something like that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely Nate and probably Steve as well could comment on that. Let me just begin by saying that both are covered in place. So a credential, we certainly expect that credential information will change. It could be something about the description. It could be offered at more locations, for example. And so the information can be updated at any time in the registry, and the publish can be updated to show those changes to the description of the credential or any of the related information with the credential. When we're talking about a version, we're really talking about a whole new version of a credential. And so, just as an example, and because Amy's on with NOCTI, they follow the international, the ISO, the international practice for updating their credentials, and so that means they have a periodic update in a new version. So that means, for example, certifications, would have a new identifier, it would have a whole new assessment and so forth, and so that would constitute a new version. So the registry handles both, and you can make updates at any time to the information about a credential or any information in the registry. And the way the registry is set up is the consumers of that information can always pull that updated information in, and then a new version of a credential would be identified as a new version, and that would entail also having a new unique CTID, and the CTID is the unique, kind of product identifier with the credential. And Nate or Steve, anything to add to that? No? Okay. Did that answer your question, Carrie?
I think so. I think so the past credential is still accessible. And so the old URL is still accessible, and the new one is accessible. What I'm not quite sure I understood is what signifies a new version in the CER. Does the publisher indicate that we want it to be a new version, or is it that it happens based on the data properties?
No, it's not inherent in the registry, meaning it's not something that the registry decides. It's something that the owner of the credential needs to determine. And so if, like, for example, I'll use NOCTI again, Amy, so NOCTI just recently updated, credentials because they do a cycle where they update. And so that what we're saying is that prior version of the credential and the URI to it can and should and will remain available. It just won't be identified in the registry as actively offered. And so what we want to be able to do is have that past version available. So for example, all the details about it could still be linked to, from other information, say the issued instance of a credential. So why don't we make a point to, on an upcoming TAC, we'll get more into what that looks like in terms of how the data is set up in the registry and how it signifies when it's just an update versus what it looks like to be a whole
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. Okay, thank you very much. And it makes sense. Appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem. So let me go on to the publishing procedure that we talked about, and I think Nate's also been putting some comments in the chat about that. So when we're talking about this authentication system, it is kind of the gateway, the door. Regardless of the type, what you're going to publish or how you're going to do it, it's the one go-to place where there's a kind of multi-part aspect to it. And so just as a reminder, this begins with the kinds of data that can get published to the registry, and those kinds of data are the credential descriptions that can refer to competencies, the organizations that offer the credential, learning opportunities, assessments, and other classes and profiles that are available through the CTDL can all be included with those descriptions. I broke out quality assurance descriptions because the validation for the credential registry also supports allowing the partners who are the quality assurance organizations, such as accreditors. And I always use accreditors because everybody knows, what that means, but it's not limited to accreditors. In other words, it's organizations that as a component of what they do, they assert a quality aspect. They can publish to the registry and competency framework. So, we know that when credentials are offered, they could refer to, competencies or, learning standards, learning objectives, those types of things. I'm couching that all under competencies. But you could also just publish competency frameworks that aren't directly referred to by a credential. So those are the things that the credential registry currently supports. And so regardless of what you're publishing, you're going to go through this authentication system. And the first thing that happens is you're going to identify the user. As a typical system, it's a one-to-one. You have to have an account. Every account is associated with an organization. There couldn't be any such thing as users that are just floating out there that are not affiliated with an organization. The organization identifies what kind of publishing method they would like to use, and whether or not they're self-publishing. And so, for example, Amy, you're just my go-to today. So if NACTI is publishing their credentials directly, they are self-publishing. That's what we mean by that. Third-party publishing could be that, say, a badging platform as an example, or a catalog product is publishing credential information with the permission of the credentialing organization. So the system is set up to identify the users, the organizations, the role of the organization as a self-publisher, a third-party publisher, and how they want to publish. And Credential Engine has a kind of a policy in place to look at those requests and then approve them. So right now, it's requiring staff to log in and look at the accounts, look at the requests, and then approve the request. Upon approval of the request, and this whole system is completely automated, so it could take just minutes. So as a person is working through, confirming their account, submitting their organization and so forth, emails are being sent, notifications are being posted and so forth, so it's all seamless to the end user. And for our methods that are currently supported through the system, there's currently 3, and that's going through the API. So what happens is once you're approved, you're going to see the API key in the account. And the API keys are one-to-one with each organization. So if you're a third-party publisher and you're publishing for, say, 3 colleges, then you would get a key for each college. And then that way, if, say, that college wants to publish later on their own, they can take their key back or they could assign it to somebody else. And so also for the third-party publishing, the system is asking for the approval of the organization offering the credential. So you won't get approved until that organization says, yes, we approve this relationship. We're going to let this other organization publish our information to the registry. So that system handles all that. It does it all, you know, automated emails and so forth, workflow. So it sounds like a lot, but it could literally take like, you know, minutes to get through the system. And the publishing methods, we're going to talk a little bit more about that here. So for the publishing methods, there's the API that we call the Registry Assistant API that Mike and Nate will talk a little bit more about in just a sec. Bulk upload, and so there's a lot of information that the registry will accept, but bulk upload wouldn't be good for every single property, but for minimum and say minimum required information, we have ways of bulk uploading. We'll be making an interface available. Right now the staff is doing the bulk uploading, but we have bulk uploaded credentials. An example is Ivy Tech uploaded all of their school credentials through bulk upload. And manual entry, we'll continue to have the manual entry available. And as we work with partners to streamline getting credentials in, we'll see if we can, you know, move from manual entry to bulk upload and using the API. But there are some credentialing organizations that offer, say, 1 credential and may have very small, you know, websites and don't really have, you know, technical staff and all that sort of stuff. So it would make sure, it would make sense that they could use the manual entry. And then we'll be talking about this year mechanisms for getting CTDL structured data from the web. And even for that option, the owner of that data would come to Credential Engine and say, we want this in the registry, come and get it. So they would go through that authentication system. So let me pause there. I think there is a big conversation going on in the chat. And Steve, you were asking to be unmuted, I think. Can you talk?
I think I can talk now.
I hear you.
I think we've covered most of what I had to.
Oh, good. I was wondering what's going on over there.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. There were some long pauses, and I was talking into them, and then somebody would start talking over me. I'm like, why is no one listening to me?
We couldn't
Anyway,
hear
yeah,
you.
So, I think.
Are you good?
Yeah. No. Clearly. All on my end.
Go ahead.
Yeah. No. I'm good. This stuff looks great. It reflects, you know, all the work we've done together to create an environment, and kudos to Nate and Mike and you for putting all.
Oh no, we just lost you again. Steve, come back. Okay, so were there any other questions in the chat that have not been addressed yet? Nate, can you help me out here?
Hey, Jeannie.
So Robbie has a question. So suppose that an organization wants to publish a credential but keep some of the associated competencies requirements non-public but still access them themselves.
Yes.
So, I mean, that's an interesting use case, Robbie. I don't know that we really, poor Steve. I don't know that we really have something in place where, you know, the user can use it to publish and get all that metadata back, but then say, well, we do with the manual. I'm gonna walk that back. With the publishing that we can control, like the manual entry and the bulk upload, that would be possible because they could choose not to publish all of it. However, we would have to make sure they're not referencing those other things. For the API, I'm not sure that we really have a way of doing that. Maybe Mike could talk about that a little bit more. And am I even answering your question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
No. Okay, you can.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, here's what I'm thinking: is let's say, you know, AT&T has some criteria. You know, it issues a credential in line repair, but for competitive reasons, it may not want to make public. It may want to use that credential internally, and also have that issued externally so that others can see that an employee there has that credential. But for competitive reasons, they might not want to have all of the stuff that's involved with it public. And certainly, you know, military, you could think of perhaps other things like that, or you know, I mean, just about any organization, potentially even an academic organization. So they want the credential there so that people can reference it and use it in their transcripts and all of that. But they don't necessarily want to have all of the data that, you know, public, so that other people can't see, in some sense, what they're doing.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I think that, like, currently with the API, there is an endpoint where you can just get everything back and just for yourself. I don't, you know, for publishing to the registry, it would be whatever you map to publish is, you know, you publish. So I get what you're saying. I'm not sure we have like a clear solution, or that somebody would go, oh, yeah, I understand. I can keep these chunks here and not publish them at all. I think that kind of we do support that in a sense, because if you choose to map what you're going to publish, so you can use the endpoint to get all your data back and use it at will, and then you could use the publish endpoint to publish to the registry and not include all of that, you know, as long as it meets the minimum data requirement.
Right, and then the
so
question,
everything minimum data requirement.
And then the sort of follow-up question is, and I mean, I'm just trying to see where the line is drawn in everybody's mind, right? Is supposing that an organization just wants to use the credential registry as a place to store their, you know, internal credentials. I mean, you know, Walmart has over 1 million employees, right? They would like to have, you know, or Hamburger U or whatever. And I mean, this is a great public resource, and they want to just store their things in here, and they really don't want anybody else to use them. Can they? Is that envisioned, or is that something just off limits? Is the entire point to have everything public, which would be fine? But the question is, what about where is that line drawn?
I guess my question would be about the use case itself. What would the benefit be of publishing something like that publicly, but then not letting the public use any of it?
Well, they're not published. I'm saying they don't want to publish it publicly. They want to use it.
Why? What would the benefit to Walmart in that scenario be to publish to the registry if none of what they publish is public? Like,
because they
why
don't
wouldn't they just keep that internal?
Well, because they don't have the internal infrastructure for doing it, and you've built it for them.
Yeah, I hear you, Robbie.
Yeah.
Right, it's a repository.
Yeah, what Robbie's saying is they could leverage the infrastructure that they don't have. I think it's a good conversation worth having. I don't think we have anything concrete, you know, right now. So we should definitely put that on the list of things to talk about some more, and, you know, look at those use cases.
Jean?
So thanks, Robbie.
Before you go on.
Sure.
Hey, Jeannie, so I have a question. It's Carla. I have a question about the earlier conversation about if new credentials get added in, and then there is an old CTDI indicating that there's an existing degree, but it's no longer offered. Are there relationships that exist between those things? And if so, how do they get relinked to the new CTDI?
So you're saying if there's a replace, and this will be, I think at the next TAC, Steve, what we need to do is kind of show literally how the publish, how the envelopes and the headers of the envelopes, how they connect all that information and so forth, so they have the status, and how answers the question that Carla just asked as an example, is how you know when it's just an update, the history of an update, versus this is a new credential and the prior version is here. So I think it'd be very helpful, Carla, for everyone in our next webinar. We literally just kind of show samples of what that looks like. And I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, Mike and Nate, if we have samples of that on the technical website, because that's of course what you're asking is of great interest. I can tell you that it is handled, and it'd probably be easier if everybody could see what that actually looks like in the registry and so forth.
We have some documentation that I think explains it in sort of the abstract, but I don't believe we have concrete examples of it.
Yeah, well, so we'll do that. We'll plan that because it's the same context came up earlier, Carla, in the meeting. The same kind of question is, well, what does it really look like? How do you know? So let's plan on that at the next TAC to literally have some good examples, and you'll be able to see how consuming systems are able to read that information, know that it's just an update to it, and know that, oh, now this is replaced by this new credential. And I see a lot of conversations going on over there in that chat. Is there anything that we need to talk about, or should we go on to the Registry Assistant API?
I think unless I missed something, I think the only open question at the moment is the one that Michael just asked. Unfortunately, I don't know enough to answer it.
Solution. I know we've got a couple of team members on that could look that up. David, or if Emily's on, do you know? I'm not sure. Those specific, examples if they're registry participants yet. But again, anyone who wants to publish credentials, you go to you begin by going to the account system and registering and getting approved for the type of publishing method that you would like to have. And then if anybody on the Credential Engine team could answer Michael's question, that would be great. And let's go ahead and Nate, why don't you talk a little bit about the Registry Assistant API, and I think Mike will add a little bit to it as well.
Okay. In real broad terms, so the Registry Assistant API is one of the publishing methods that Jeannie covered a little bit ago. This offers just a little bit more detail on that. The idea is that you have your system over on the left there in blue and purple. So what your system is going to do is take the data from its various sources, whether that's directly in your system or whether you're publishing on behalf of another organization, in which case the data is coming to you as a sort of third party, whether your data is in one database or multiple, or if you have spreadsheets or any other source, I guess, of data. The important thing is that your system is going to map all of that to our input format, which we've got here is the CER Assistant API classes, which essentially are just a set of classes, so structures with properties on them, that are directly related to CTDL. So one of the things that we've done in the API is provide a sort of, I suppose, simplified way of mapping things to CTDL. So CTDL requires a very, very specific structure in order to function properly, and the goal of the API is to make it a lot easier to get data into that structure. So you map your data to the, again, these sort of class structures that we provide to you. And then you send it off to one of our two API endpoints, either the format or the publish endpoint. Format, as I guess the name implies, will just take the data, map it to, so for lack of a better term, real CTDL, and then send that data back to you in a JSON LD format. And what you can do with that, aside from just using it for testing and development, which I suppose would be maybe the main purpose of it, is get an idea of what your data looks like in CTDL. So if you're perhaps developing a process to output data in CTDL directly for your website or something, you can use that to compare against, or you can actually use that to just, you can put the results of those API transactions on your website directly, or you can cache them and do it that way if that makes sense. The other endpoint would be the publish endpoint, which will again format the data into CTDL and then pass it along to the registry itself. So as long as the data you send to us meets our minimum data requirements, and it maps correctly to the input classes. There shouldn't be any trouble getting it mapped to CTDL and then passed along to the registry, in which case what you get back is the result of that transaction, or what your system gets back, I should say. So I don't know if, Mike, if you had anything to add to that, or... Oh, hold on. Mike, you're muted, I think.
There
we go.
Right, so with the enabling of the account...
We can't hear Mike.
The main has been added now. My mic is on. Can't hear me?
No, we hear you now. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so we talked about the accounts authentication system that's been enabled, so that's allowed us now to fully implement the use of an API key. So I dropped in the chat a link.
Your microphone has been turned on.
Now my microphone. Sorry, I'm getting a message about my microphone. Can people hear me? Oh, okay, weird. Okay, so yeah, I put a link in the chat to the okay to the CredReg site where we describe using your API key. So now that we do have the account system, the first thing you do is you create an account, confirm your account, set up your organization. A lot of people may already have a starting organization because it would have been brought over from the publishing system. So once your account is completely set up, you submit it for approval. Then once it's approved, an account will be created in the Credential Registry for use for publishing. There's a secret publishing key that is generated and isn't publicly visible. Instead, we have the CTID of the organization and an API key for the publishing organization. So in this example, you can see if you went to your dashboard, you'd see the CTID for your organization and their publishing key. So this publishing key, as I said, it's kind of like it's a proxy to the real key. And if ever someone thought it was compromised, it can be regenerated and the original key is kept secret. So the API key will be published in the header. Example here, we have the header name, authorization, value, API token, and then the actual key. So when you're ready to use the publishing part of the API, and for the sandbox you don't need this, but for production you would, then you would provide that information. So I have an example of briefly how that would look when you're publishing sample organization here. So you would, example, you have your API key, you get your organization identifier from the account site, you set up your organization. This is just a simple example of very little data. So when you format the request, I can provide a link shortly. GitHub, we have a list of all the input classes. So the main input class in this case, organization request, you put in your formatted organization. The publishing organization identifier is essentially the CTID from the account system. You format your request, you serialize it to JSON. In the headers, you add your API key, and then you call the API. So, as I say, now that the account system is enabled, it's a matter of going to the account site, completing the organization, submitting it for approval. And once approved, then your API key will be available. And we're working on kind of a process for having people first publish to the sandbox so we can look at it, see if there's any issues or if people have concerns. We can then see what they're publishing and work with them to ensure that the data is properly formatted and then ready to be published to the registry.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Anybody have any questions for Mike? No? So, Nate, would you like to talk a little bit about the search options?
A little bit, yeah. I may have to Steve for some of this. So right now the registry offers sort of two basic ways of getting at the data that's in it, other than directly accessing the records by their CTID. They boil down to being search APIs with a variety of options to them. So the first one is, I don't know if there's an official name for it, I've called it the JSON subdocument method, where essentially you can search for sections of a CTDL record. So if you send the API a JSON that is essentially a fragment of a record, and you're looking for anything that matches that fragment, what you'll get back is the entire record itself. There's some links there to documentation and a somewhat outdated developer tool that kind of shows you what those queries look like. The other one is a newer thing that they have just much more recently set up. It uses a search API called GraphQL, which uses a sort of JSON-like syntax. It's not exactly JSON, but it's very similar. The idea is that it leverages, I believe on the back end, I could be this is Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe on the back end it leverages Neo4j for graphing purposes. But the queries themselves are what you would see in the documentation and example links there at the bottom. But the idea there is that GraphQL lets you pull back only the fields that you need from a given record. So if perhaps you only need the name and the description for whatever reason, or maybe you only need the costs or some other particular piece of data, you don't need the entire record. You just request only what you need with that. So Steve, if you have anything to elaborate, now would be the time.
So this is not the final location for some of these specs. We just checked them in quickly so that people could have access to them. But we do have spec and examples of how to use the GraphQL tool. We're pretty excited about how it came out. It's important to say that we aren't using GraphQL as a general purpose query language. I don't know that anyone is. What we're using is GraphQL as a language to allow us to describe certain kinds of queries which are permitted. And so the example will show you the kinds of queries you can ask, and then we can return results that are pretty flexible within those sort of search constraints. But it's not, to be clear, you can't just go read the GraphQL, spec and then just start writing arbitrary queries and expect them to work. So with that said, where you are starting to encounter use cases where you want to access graph data out of the credential registry, you can share those with us. You can post issues into the site, or email the group or whatever, and we will certainly modify and expand the language to support the common use cases that people have or need. So, or you can send us a pull request if you want to do it yourself.
Good deal. Thank you, Steve and Nate and Mike for talking about the infrastructure piece. And really what I just want to say in closing about it is there is a set of services around the credential registry that are available now. As with any kind of large technical infrastructure such as this, there will continue to be updates. It's certainly not 100% done, but it does all work. Everything is available. And as a part of that, we want to be able to support the use cases, as Steve mentioned, both on the publishing side and the consuming side. And so we're doing that in a variety of ways, working with anyone who wants to publish. Your first step is to set up your account, make your request to publish by identifying the method that you're going to use, and then we'll begin to work with you on that. And then, again, going back to our earlier information about those application showcases, we want to be able to support the various use cases, whether or not you're publishing or consuming, so we can make sure that the way you can get the data in and the way you can get the data out is useful. And that concludes all of the topics that we wanted to cover today. We're done a little bit early. If anybody wants to talk about anything else or ask some additional questions. No? All right. Well, I love to see that chat going. It's definitely going today. So thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to get together today. We really appreciate it. It's been a while. We'll, continue to bring the TAC together at the end of each month. And I'm hoping for our next topics, we'll cover some of the questions that came up around, well, what does the data really look like when it's in the registry, so users of the data know what it means and how to use it. And then Robbie, some of the things, you know, around the infrastructure, because really what you were talking about is the larger kind of services. You know, what are what is the infrastructure, the integrator services that would be valuable that Credential Engine can have out there between the registry and the publisher. So, thanks again. Not hearing any questions and seeing everybody's fingers must be worn out from all that chat activity. Thanks so much and have a wonderful day. And hey, Patty, thanks for coming to my office.
Sure. Amazing.
Thanks, everyone.